Hello, my sweet summer children. I'm back with the juice to get you through the long night. So Game of Thrones season 8 is over, but the analyzation of Game of Thrones is not. There were tons of Easter eggs in the season that I haven't seen talked about, which I'm doing an entire video on. But there is one that I want to talk about. It's from a book that Sam has in season 7. In this book that Sam was reading, the book that had the cat's paw in it, there is another blade to the left. The cat's paw killed the Night King, the Ice King, and this other blade looks like the one that killed Daenerys, the Fire Queen. This is subtle, but the implications are huge for the actual story that is being told. The name of the story is A Song of Ice and Fire, and George has said one of his inspirations was a poem. I've talked about this before. The poem is by Robert Frost. It's called Fire and Ice. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if I had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. In the 8th and final season of Game of Thrones, the White Walkers were defeated. The ice was defeated, but the fire destroyed shit anyway. So there is this idea of Daenerys being the actual villain of A Song of Ice and Fire. I don't think that's the case. I do not think that was set up, at least not on the show. But in the books, if we actually look deep into all of the published books in the series, the 5 main books, and the World's Book, and the Tales of Dunk and Ned, Fire and Blood, and the Rogue Prince, and the Princess and the Queen, you can see connections between the White Walkers and the Valyrians. And I don't think it's a coincidence. But more importantly, you can see that George has wrote more history on the Targaryens and the Valyrians than all the other houses and races combined. This could be because they were royalty and royalty is written about more often, or it could be by design and it could foreshadow the true meaning of ice and fire. So before we do this deep dive into Ice and Fire and the Valyrians and the White Walkers, I would like to take a brief moment to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. If you don't know what Skillshare is, it's an online learning community for creators with more than 25,000 courses in design, business, and more. Whether you want to fuel your curiosity, creativity, or career, Skillshare is the perfect place to keep you learning and thriving. As you guys know, I've been venturing into advanced video editing to make my YouTube videos better for you guys, and Skillshare has tons of courses on that kind of stuff. They have courses on animation, cinematography, and much more. But also, I'm really digging Storytelling 101, Characters, Conflict, Context, and Craft. It's a beginner level creative writing class, and you already know I'm all about that. So Skillshare is super affordable. Join more than 7 million creators learning with Skillshare. Go to the link in my description box, and you can try it for absolutely free for 2 months. But anyway, back to the fire and ice. Clearly, the Valyrians and their dragons are the fire and the White Walkers are the ice. I'm going to start with the similarities between the White Walkers and the Valyrians. So let's start with like the basics. And all we need for that is a map. The region of the world the White Walkers come from is called the Lands of Always Winter. The region of the world the Valyrians come from is called the Lands of Long Summer. Also, you can look at this one phrase. This kind of connects the two. It is said that the White Walkers want to bring on the winter that never ends, the long night. And Melisandre talks about Azor Ahai, the champion of fire, and Azor Ahai bringing on the summer that never ends. So there's some kind of correlation going on there as well. So when you look at the White Walkers, in the show, the White Walkers are beastly, ugly, creepy things, monstrous looking. But in the books, they do not look like this. George has described them as the Sidhe from Irish folklore and mythology, basically like fairies. The others are not dead. They are strange, beautiful. Think of the Sidhe made of ice, something like that, a different sort of life. Inhuman, elegant, dangerous. Yes, so they're not ugly. The White Walkers are actually beautiful, strangely beautiful. You know who else is strangely beautiful? The Valyrians. The Valyrians are said to have a strange, unnatural beauty. They have hair that's the color of beaten silver and gold, and eyes that are purple. The White Walkers are known to destroy and enslave, and so are the Valyrians. We know Daenerys as a loving queen, a Misa figure, the mother. But Daenerys' ancestors were quite awful, actually, like really awful. Most of them. Not all of them. Not all of them. But we will get back to that. So, the Children of the Forest created the White Walkers to protect them from the savage First Men, whom invaded their lands and started to cut down their sacred weirwoods and slaughtered the Children of the Forest wherever they found them. The children created the White Walkers, and the White Walkers protected them. The White Walkers were a good weapon. They were a good idea. Until they weren't. Until the children lost control of them. This is similar to where Daenerys' story seems to have went. She saved tons of people. She liberated hundreds of thousands of people. But she lost control, or she embraced her dragon identity, her Valyrian blood that flowed in her veins all along. She embraced it and killed just as many people as she had previously saved. So then the question arises, who is the real villain of the story? Was the villain the White Walkers? Was the villain Daenerys? Disclaimer, I really like Daenerys, and this video has been the hardest thing ever that I've had to write. So let me just say, I don't think Daenerys is a villain. I think she's a hero of her own story. George has said every one of his POV characters is the hero of their own story. And this is a story about Jon and Daenerys, but let's move on. There's this surface level dichotomy between ice and fire that is set up between the White Walkers and Valyrians, but when you actually look deeper, they are so similar. In Westeros, especially in the north, we hear legends of the Long Night and the generational Long Winter and White Walkers and Grumpkins and Snarks, but to the east, we hear no tales of White Walkers. So what happened in the east? What happened that caused the Red Wastes and the Grey Wastes? And why were the 5 forts built? And what happens in Asshai? Well, there are the Gemstone Emperors. We could talk about that, but we don't have to go back that far. We don't need to. Dragons happened to Essos. The Valyrians happened to Essos. Thousands of years ago in Valyria, the dragons ruled. And also the Valyrians are likely descendant from the Gemstone Emperors, but we'll do another video on that. So the Valyrians have a bloody history. Violence and conquering, that was their shit. And they did it with dragons. The freehold of Valyria was ruled by the Dragon Lords. It was several rival houses. House Targaryen was among them, but they weren't really all that powerful. The Valyrians were also slavers, and the worst kind of slavers. They conquered cities and toppled empires. Old Geese, which is the Giscari region that encompassed Meereen, Yunkai, and Astapor, went to war against the Valyrians. The 5 great wars between the Freehold and Old Geese when the world was young are the stuff of legend. Conflagrations that ended each time in the victory of the Valyrians over the Giscari. It was during the 5th and final war that the Freehold chose to make sure there would not be a 6th. The ancient brick walls of Old Geese, first erected by Grasdan the Great in ancient days, were razed. The colossal pyramids and temples and homes were given over to Dragonflame. The fields were sown with salt, lime, and skulls. Many of the Giscari were slain, and still others were enslaved and died laboring for their conquerors. Thus the Giscari became but another part of the new Valyrian Empire. The Giscari people the Valyrians conquered were the first people that the Valyrians enslaved. So in the books, Daenerys is going to definitely be going to war with the Giscari people, just like her ancestors did. I mean, she already technically has, but in the show, we see the dragons just come through, the Dothraki come through, but we don't see it. We don't see children getting killed and things like that. So I think the Battle of Meereen is going to be like the 5th war between the Valyrians and the Giscari, and it's going to be awful. But anyway, the Valyrians conquered civilization after civilization. The need of more slaves caused the need of more conquest. The Valyrians caused the Andals to flee from Andalos and the Rhoynish peoples to flee to Westeros. I'm not going to even go into detail on how the waters ran red with blood the next time the dragons came. So you see, the dragons and the Valyrians were just as bad for the people of Essos as the White Walkers were to Westeros. Even if you look at Westeros, Aegon the Conqueror, after he set his sights on Westeros, death and destruction followed him. Harrenhal is proof of that. He burned Harrenhal and everything in it. What Maegor the Cruel did to the Sept of Remembrance is proof of that. The dragons are like atomic bombs. They're like weapons of mass destruction. There are so many examples of the violence caused by House Targaryen, the Valyrians, and their dragons over the last 5,000 years. And it seems like George R.R. Martin is working at the possible Valyrians and their dragons are no better than the White Walkers. They are the same. They pose the same threat to humanity. The thing that separates the dragons from the White Walkers is that the dragons are normalized. We're used to them. We've heard history upon history upon history about the dragons. We know the names of the first dragons that came with the Targaryens from Valyria. We know the names of every Targaryen dragon that ever lived in Westeros. We saw 3 dragons get hatched from eggs. We're used to them. But the White Walkers, we don't know anything about them. The White Walkers are the fairy tale, the legend. People in our story don't even believe in them. But just because we are used to dragons, it doesn't mean they are any less dangerous than the White Walkers. Like, the dragons and the White Walkers were both controlled until they weren't. And I think this could be one of the big themes of A Song of Ice and Fire. Valyrians versus White Walkers. They are both equally a threat to humanity. Yes, we love Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion, but think of what would happen should the dragons fall into the wrong hands. I mean, just look at the show. The White Walkers were in check. They couldn't pass the wall until they got a dragon. But when it comes to the show and Daenerys going all fire and blood on King's Landing, I'm not sure it actually happens exactly like that. If it does, it will be with way more finesse. But the reason I don't think it will happen like that is because there is another with Valyrian blood that was excluded from the show. Aegon Targaryen, Rhaegar's alleged son, whom is more likely a Blackfyre. But what are the implications of Aegon? How much of his story has been left out or composited with someone else? What if Aegon gets a dragon? What if Daenerys and Aegon battle dragon versus dragon over King's Landing? And that's how it burns. I do think it will burn. I think George is setting up ice and fire being both the most destructive forces of the world, and I think this book is a huge clue pointing right towards that, even though you don't think of that in that moment until after you see Daenerys get killed. But what do you think? Are the Valyrians just as bad as the White Walkers? Let me know in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching, and be looking out for the Easter egg video that I'm working on. That one is going to be juicy. Thanks to everyone that supports me on Patreon. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Please click that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and join the Sweet Summer family. Okay, my sweet summer children, have a good day.
Shame.